He walked straight to the front camera. No hesitation, no looking around. He knew exactly where it was, and he reached out and disabled it in seconds. And then he walked away, leaving the cameras in the back completely untouched. That is the part nobody is really talking about. Most people who have been following this case have the same image locked in their minds: a gloved hand. A doorbell camera going dark at 1:47 in the morning on February 1st, and the immediate, unmistakable sense that whoever approached that house that night had been there before. Not physically, maybe, but mentally. They had mapped it. They knew what they were walking into. But that front camera, the one everyone keeps talking about, the one that made headlines, that might not be the most important camera in this story. The cameras nobody tampered with might be. And that is where something does not add up. Before we go any further, I want to be clear about how this channel operates. Everything here comes from verified reporting by established news organizations, from publicly available records, and from commentary attributed to named sources. When something comes from a single report, I will tell you that. When I am offering analysis rather than confirmed fact, I will tell you that too. No one mentioned in this video has been publicly named as a suspect in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. This remains an active federal investigation. She is still missing, and her family deserves real answers. The only thing I can offer is a careful look at what the evidence actually says, and more importantly, what it seems to be suggesting. So let's build this properly. Nancy Guthrie is 73 years old. She is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, the co-anchor of The Today Show. She was living in the Sabino Canyon area of Tucson, Arizona, when she was abducted from her home in the early hours of February 1st, 2026. The FBI took over the investigation, classifying it as a federal kidnapping case. That alone tells you the people working this are not treating it as a local matter. They are treating it as something much more serious. Now, what we know for certain about the surveillance at her home. The front doorbell camera was a confirmed Nest device. The Puma County Sheriff's Department publicly stated it was disconnected at approximately 1:47 in the morning. That is not speculation. That is on the record. What is also on the record, reported by multiple established outlets, is that the FBI worked directly with Google's back-end systems to recover whatever pre-disconnection imagery still existed after the device was disabled. Think about what that means for a second. They did not just pull a local file from a hard drive. They had to go into Google's infrastructure. That is not a routine evidence collection step. That is a significant technical undertaking, and it suggests that whoever disabled that camera understood what they were doing well enough that standard recovery methods were not enough. That is the version of events most people know. The gloved hand, the deliberate disabling, the sophisticated data recovery effort that followed. But here is the problem. There were other cameras. According to sources briefed on the investigation, as reported by ABC News, Nancy Guthrie's property had additional motion-activated cameras positioned around the backyard, the side yard, and the pool area. These were not continuous recording devices. They were the kind that activate when motion is detected, producing still images, short bursts, what investigators described as thumbnail captures. And according to those same sources, the FBI recovered imagery from those devices. They were intact. They had not been smashed. They had not been disabled. They were right where they had always been, and they were still functional enough for investigators to pull data from them. And on the night Nancy Guthrie was taken, those cameras captured nothing suspicious. Let that sit for a moment. Working cameras, an active abduction, and silence. A source familiar with the investigation was asked to describe the significance of that silence. What it meant that cameras covering the back and sides of the property recorded nothing meaningful during the window when a 73-year-old woman was being taken from her home. And the word that source used was odd. In any other context, that might sound like a minor detail, but federal investigators do not reach for dramatic language. They are trained to be precise, to be measured, to say exactly what they mean and nothing more. So when someone inside this investigation describes a piece of evidence as odd, That is not a throwaway word. That means something about what those cameras showed, or did not show, does not line up with what the rest of the evidence suggests should have happened. The picture is not behaving the way it should. And in a case like this, when the evidence stops behaving the way it should, there is usually a reason. Here is what the backyard cameras had been doing in the days before February 1st. They were active, regularly, picking up motion, generating images, doing exactly what they were designed to do. And according to sourced reporting from ABC News, those cameras captured several people, not once, but on multiple occasions, moving through the backyard and side yard in the days leading up to the night Nancy was taken. Multiple people, multiple visits. And the FBI reportedly has those images. So let's hold both of those facts at the same time, because this is where the timeline starts to feel off. In the days before the abduction, cameras triggering, multiple individuals, repeated presence near the property. On the night of the abduction, nothing suspicious. The same devices, the same motion zones, the same backyard. And silence. That contrast is not a small wrinkle in the story. That contrast reshapes the entire way the timeline has to be understood. Because if those cameras were functioning normally, if they were doing their job in the days before, then the silence on the night itself is not a technical failure. It is a question, a very specific, very uncomfortable question about what those cameras were actually pointed at and what, or who, managed to avoid them. But something did not feel right about leaving it there. Because there is a second claim in this case that widens the conversation even further. And this is the part where I need to slow down, because the sourcing matters. On Ashley Banfield's podcast, a source described as having law enforcement knowledge made a claim that goes beyond what the ABC News reporting established. According to that source, Nancy Guthrie had multiple cameras at the property, and they were smashed. Not disabled remotely, not disconnected. Physically destroyed. The account went further still, alleging that exterior lights around the property were also disabled. Now, I want to be precise about how we treat this. That is a single source claim. At the time this script was written, it had not been independently confirmed by multiple mainstream outlets. It may be accurate. It may be partially accurate. It may be missing context that changes what it means. What matters is not dismissing it and not overstating it. It is one data point, but it is a significant one, because if it is correct, it points to something very specific about the nature of this operation. Destroying multiple cameras and disabling exterior lighting around a property is not the behavior of someone improvising in the moment. You do not do that on instinct. You do not do that by accident. That kind of preparation requires prior knowledge of the layout, where the lights are positioned, which cameras cover which angles, which devices represent the highest risk of identification. In law enforcement terms, that pattern of behavior points toward what investigators call pre-operational surveillance. It suggests someone studied the scene before they ever acted on it. And that is when things changed. Because that is where the tension in the reporting becomes impossible to ignore. If multiple cameras and lights were systematically targeted and destroyed, why were the backyard and side yard cameras reportedly left intact? Why did those specific devices survive? Why were they still functional enough for the FBI to recover imagery from them? If someone truly went through that property and dismantled its surveillance network in a comprehensive, deliberate way, leaving active cameras behind is not a small oversight. It is either a mistake or it is a choice. And here is why the mistake theory starts to fall apart. Those backyard cameras had already captured people on the property. Multiple people. Multiple times. In the days before the abduction. Which means, if whoever carried out this crime had been near that property in the preceding days, there was a real possibility those cameras had already recorded them. And if that is true, the idea that those same cameras were simply overlooked on the night of February 1st becomes very difficult to accept. You do not spend days near a property, get captured on its cameras, and then forget those cameras exist when it counts the most, which leaves the other possibility, that those cameras were not overlooked, that they were intentionally left alone, and that the reason they were left alone is that whoever planned this already knew, specifically, precisely, what those cameras could and could not see. Their motion zones, their angles, the gaps between what they covered and what they missed. That is not a theory built on nothing. That is a theory built on the shape of the evidence itself. What do you think really happened here? Because this next part is where the case takes a turn that most people haven't fully considered, and I don't want you to miss it. The three explanations for why those backyard cameras survived are not equally weighted. The first is that whoever carried out the abduction simply did not know they were there. Possible, but increasingly hard to reconcile with the level of precision shown at the front door. The second is that physically accessing and destroying those cameras would have required moving deeper into the property, creating too much exposure, too much time on scene, too much risk. So the front camera, the one most likely to capture a face or a vehicle on approach, became the priority. And the backyard cameras were an acceptable trade-off. And the third possibility is the one that keeps surfacing no matter how many times you try to set it aside, that those cameras did not need to be physically destroyed. Because whoever planned this operation already knew how to move around them, already knew what would trigger them and what would not, already knew the exact geography of the property's surveillance in a way that allowed them to navigate it without leaving a usable record. Three explanations. Three very different pictures of who we are looking for, and the evidence on its own does not fully rule out any of them. But the silence from those cameras, on a night when they had been so recently and so regularly active, keeps pulling the weight of the story toward that third possibility. Not as a certainty, but as a shape. A behavioral shape that is very hard to explain away, and that shape has a name in investigative terms. It is called insider knowledge. Modern home security cameras are not standalone devices. That is something worth understanding before we go any further, because it changes the way you have to think about what happened here. A Nest camera does not just sit on a wall and record. It is connected to the internet. It runs on software. It communicates through a Wi-Fi network, and critically, it is managed through a cloud account, which means the device itself is only part of the system. The account behind it is the other part. And anyone who has access to that account has a level of control over those cameras that does not require them to ever physically touch the hardware. This is not a cinematic hacking scenario. This is not someone in a dark room running code. The most straightforward form of interference in a system like this is much simpler than that. It is account access, login credentials, the kind of access you might have if you knew someone well enough to know their passwords, or if you had spent enough time in their home to know where those passwords were stored. If someone had that access, they could potentially adjust motion sensitivity settings. They could alter the zones those cameras were monitoring. They could change the way the system behaved, without leaving a mark on the physical devices, without breaking anything, without creating the kind of evidence that points directly back to them. To be absolutely clear, there has been no public confirmation that anything like this happened in this case. That is analysis. That is the direction the evidence suggests when you look at it as a whole. But it is not a confirmed finding. I want that distinction to be precise. But here's the thing about that analysis. It does not feel like a stretch. It feels like the logical next question. Because the gap between what those backyard cameras were doing in the days before February 1st and what they produced on the night itself is not a gap that resolves easily. And when a gap like that exists in the evidence, when something that should have happened did not, the natural investigative question is, why? Was it physical? Was it digital? Was it both? That is the question sitting at the center of the timeline around 1:47 in the morning. The front camera goes dark at that moment. That is confirmed. That is on the record. But what is not publicly known, what has not been detailed by law enforcement or established reporting, is what the backyard cameras were doing around that exact same time. And that distinction matters more than it might seem at first. Think about the three scenarios and what each one means. In the first scenario, the backyard cameras had already stopped registering motion before 1:47 a.m. They went quiet before the front camera was ever touched. If that is what happened, It suggests that someone took steps to neutralize those devices ahead of the physical act at the front door. It means the disabling of the doorbell camera was not the beginning of the operation. It was somewhere in the middle or near the end. In the second scenario, those cameras were generating normal overnight triggers right up until approximately 1:47. And then they stopped. Around the same moment, the doorbell went dark. If that is what the timestamps show, that is not a coincidence. That is coordination. Two things happening at once, across different parts of the same property, in the same narrow window of time. In the third scenario, the backyard cameras never stopped running at all. They were functioning continuously throughout the night. They just did not detect anything meaningful during the window when Nancy was taken, which means attention shifts away from the devices and toward the person, toward how the property was approached, toward whether entry and exit happened through an area those cameras simply could not see, or whether someone moved through the property in a way that was specifically designed to avoid triggering them. Each one of those scenarios leads somewhere different. Each one describes a different level of knowledge, a different level of planning, a different kind of person. And the FBI, because they have the timestamps, because they have the trigger logs from those devices, almost certainly knows which of those three scenarios is closest to the truth. That information exists, it is just not public yet. And that is where the insider knowledge angle becomes impossible to set aside. Because think about what it would take to know all of this in advance. To know where the front doorbell was positioned and what field of view it covered. To know the motion zones on the backyard cameras, where they started and where they ended. To know the gaps, the blind spots, the parts of the property you could move through without creating a record. To know the home network. To know the account used to manage the devices. That is not the knowledge of a stranger. That is the knowledge of someone with access. Not just physical access to the property, but intimate familiarity with how it worked, how it was set up, how it could be navigated. The front doorbell camera was targeted directly and disabled. The backyard cameras were left physically untouched. In the days before, those cameras captured multiple people on repeated visits. On the night itself, they produced nothing suspicious. When you hold all of that together, not as separate pieces, but as one connected picture, the theory of insider knowledge does not feel incidental. It feels like the frame the entire evidence is sitting inside. There is a phrase that keeps coming back to me when I think about this case. The signature of insider knowledge is not always found in what was destroyed. Sometimes it is found in what was left alone, and somehow still failed to matter. That is not a comfortable thought. It is not supposed to be. Because if that framing is correct, then this case is not really about a stranger who showed up in the night and got lucky. It is about someone who knew enough about Nancy Guthrie's life, her home, her routines, her security setup, to move through it like they had been there before. Maybe because they had. Maybe because the days of pre-abduction activity captured on those backyard cameras are not random background noise. Maybe those images are the beginning of the answer. The FBI reportedly has them. They are working to identify who appeared on that property in the days before February 1st. That identification effort, those thumbnails from a motion-activated camera that was never tampered with, may end up being more revealing than anything recovered from the front doorbell that was deliberately destroyed. And that is the detail that keeps pulling me back to this case. The camera he went after, the one he planned for, the one he reached out and disabled with a gloved hand at 1:47 in the morning, that camera got attention. That camera made headlines. But the cameras he left alone? Those were still running, still generating images, still building a record that no one thought to erase. Sometimes what a person does not do tells you more about them than what they do. And in this case, the silence from those backyard cameras is not the absence of evidence. It might be the most important evidence there is. There is something I keep thinking about when I look at this case from the outside, and I want to share it because it feels relevant in a way that is hard to ignore. When someone goes to the trouble of disabling a specific camera at a specific time in a specific way, and then moves through the rest of a property without leaving a trace, that is not just planning. That is a certain kind of relationship to the space, a comfort level, an ease, the kind of thing you only develop when a place does not feel foreign to you. Strangers are nervous. Strangers make mistakes. Strangers do not know which camera covers which corner, or which part of the yard sits just outside the motion zone. But someone who knows a place, really knows it, moves through it differently. And the way this property was navigated on the night of February 1st suggests someone who is not guessing. That is not a conclusion. It is an observation. But it is one that the evidence keeps pointing toward, and until the silence from those backyard cameras is explained. Until we know why cameras that had been so active went so quiet at the exact moment it mattered most. That observation is going to stay at the center of this case. Nancy Guthrie has been missing since February 1st, 2026. She is 73 years old. The investigation is active. If you have any information at all, please contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or submit a tip at tips.fbi.gov. That number matters. That tip line matters. Someone knows something. Notebook V. Thanks you for watching. These cases are not easy to sit with. And the fact that you stayed with this all the way through, that means something. If this video made you think, made you question something, made you see the evidence a little differently, share it. The more eyes on a case like this, the more pressure there is for answers. And I want to leave you with one question. Not about the evidence, not about the timeline, just this. If the cameras he left alone end up being the thing that breaks this case open, what does that say about how well he really knew what he was doing? Think about that.